Hello, I'm Llewellyn, the host of House Chronicle. Thank you for coming along. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Clayton Powell III. And today we have a return guest after many years, Dan Raviv, former CBS News correspondent and a fairly prolific author. Dan, welcome back to the broadcast. Tell us, please, about your latest book.
It's great to be here. And Llewellyn, I'd like to thank, and Adam, hello. We were colleagues at CBS News, by the way, some years ago. So a very warm hello for Adam. Thanks for asking about the books. You say I'm fairly prolific. I hope that I'm fair and prolific, because I try to be down the middle on most things about news and controversies. But my latest book, and I do thank you for asking, is called The Quest for Significance. I think the audience here on White House Chronicle can see the cover, but let me explain. The quest for significance is the notion that all of us, sometimes without noticing it, need to matter. Our lives need to be noticed. We need respect. We need dignity. And if we don't get it, dangerous things can happen. As a matter of fact, with my co-author, who is a very highly acclaimed social psychologist, Professor Arie Kruglanski, together we have, well, made it kind of a history of humankind. Ever since the cave people and through Julius Caesar and Catherine the Great, and anyone who wants to call themselves the Great, they obviously wanted significance. And so did Vladimir Putin when he invaded Ukraine, and so did Donald Trump. But the loss of significance can be dangerous and can spark terrorism, wars, of course, suicide, if everyone's taken away your sense that you matter to anybody. And so I learned a lot about psychology by writing it, and I tried to make it a readable, understandable book that in the end we say, if you understand this fact, how significance is so important to you, apply it to the people around you.
Dan, here's one description of your book. The quest for significance propels our actions, governs our feelings, dominates our thoughts, pervasively affecting our happiness, pursuits, and relationships. That's a tall order. That's bigger than money, sex, or power, or maybe it's all of those wrapped up together. How would you define significance?
I mean, really, thank you for bringing it up, because some people think it's obvious. Oh, yeah, everybody wants to be a big shot. But we're saying it's something that we all crave. And the definition of significance, again, I'll use synonyms, if you will: dignity, respect, and then the sense that your life matters. So you have an impact on other people. You want to feel that. So, by the way, we think this applies to terrible people, say terrorists, suicide bombers, but also applies to philanthropists. They want their lives to matter, so they'll be remembered in some way. It can be positive, it can be negative, but I also claim that it applies to the little gal and the little guy. Everyone you meet, if you really pay attention and maybe ask them, what's important to you, you'll discover that people value different things, and often their need for significance gets triggered by various events. A job opportunity or losing a great job they had. So they'll feel great, they'll feel low. They might be ignored on social networks. Can you imagine the feeling it gives people when they get a like, and a retweet and all that? In our modern world, everyone seems to be seeking significance. I mean, why else would you be on, say, TikTok or Instagram, recording yourself for a minute and putting it out there? Hey, everybody, listen to what I have to say. I mean, we all know, those of us who have been journalists for decades, and that's all three of us, we didn't experience that everybody thought they could be the news teller and the storyteller. But Llewellyn, I heard from you recently that you think it is definitely a trend. It's not the brand name sources of news that control what we all talk about. It seems to be the little guys and the little gals.
Well, I think it has changed tremendously and in a very short time, and I'd be interested in your view of this. It used to be that the primary newspapers, and we can name them as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, really controlled the national debate. They were the central things in the national attention, and they dictated the agenda with the front page, not deliberately, but what they chose to cover, what they unearthed, etc. Now it's quite different. They are reporting very largely, and are compelled to report on what came out overnight on X, and on social media in general, and Truth Social in particular, the president's primary personal megaphone. This has changed journalism. We're catching up all the time. We're not leading in the way that we once did. Not that we ever thought we were leading, but we were. I wonder how you feel about that.
Very much so. Working at CBS News, though most of my experience was in bureaus far away, usually overseas. But then I had my career in the Washington Bureau, and yes, I could see it, absolutely. Whatever was on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal generally would make its way onto the CBS Evening News and other major networks. And then over the years, as every little guy and every little gal had their own thing to say, and some of them went viral, especially if it was a little piece of video, then it was sure to get on TV broadcasts. But you know, it's part of Donald Trump's success as a candidate, getting elected president twice, that he became kind of a master of it, right? What he had to say as a businessman and later as a candidate, you know, might not have been the deepest, most researched statement or conclusion. I'll say that's even true now, even though he's president of the United States. He doesn't seem to be depending on his daily intelligence brief from the CIA. He just tells us what's on his mind. It is the spirit of the times. And often what he says on Truth Social or other sites, what Trump says is what ends up leading the news, because everyone in the news business feels they have to grapple with it. It is important, it isn't important, it's true, it's false, it's fake news. But yeah, we have to deal with it. He is, after all, the president of the United States.
And so much of this is generational. Dan, you and I worked at CBS some decades ago, and the news, the journalism had very broad appeal. Fast forward 3-4 decades, and very interesting, unintended, controlled experiment took place here in Washington, D.C. on the commercial all-news radio station, WTOP. Powerhouse on AM radio, as AM was fading. They decided to simulcast on FM. And then during a snowstorm, somebody said, why aren't you also on the internet? So the program director, you may know him, Jim Farley, he said, our audience pushed us onto all three platforms. Identical programming. AM radio, FM radio, same program, 10 years younger. Online, same programming, 10 years younger again. So the same journalism may in fact appeal to different audiences on different platforms. Then you get the fragmentation, and what you're talking about were, you know, people who are not journalists, people who are what we used to think of as the audience, become part of the story.
Yeah, the same people who might write the letters to the editor, or even on a radio or TV station, you might invite some comments and maybe include them somehow. But now they have, in effect, their own radio stations, let's say podcasts, in effect, that are done by people. Oh, also by me, right? My specialty, the Middle East. I said, I have to have my say. So I've got the Mossad files every week, a half hour of audio. And sometimes if it's an interview that works as video, I'll put that out, because who's to stop you? The sky's the limit. You don't know who you'll reach. So I've experienced this too, Adam, but it absolutely means that brand name journalism that was once considered reliable has lost a lot of its special quality. However, I noticed that financially, certainly the New York Times is an example. They're reported to be making a lot of money because they made the adjustment successfully, still putting out a credible newspaper, but working very hard on the New York Times website, also having audio programs, podcasts like The Daily, using video on their website. So the New York Times wanted to survive. Now, the Washington Post tried the same, but was less successful. You either have it or you don't, and maybe they'll get better at it. The Los Angeles Times, again, a checkered business history, but the owner knows that it's not all about the paper anymore. I mean, I bet Llewellyn especially, you still enjoy a newspaper, right? You can hold it, you can turn the page. You too, Adam? I mean, I do prefer it, but like many journalists, I travel so much that I think it's great that on my iPad, I can be reading, even page by page, the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and I do so. But so I hope paper doesn't die. But, you know, on the other hand, it's not enough for those big companies to make a living.
I'd like to remind you that I've made some effort to give you significance, and that is I have quoted you, Dan, for a long time now on something you said to me once. You said, my job is very simple. I try to find out what's going on and tell people. And in my view, that is the best description of this trade of journalism that I have ever heard. And whenever I get involved in one of these deep, profound, or read something, I think Dan got it right. It's actually very simple. Have you modified that view in any way over time?
Well, maybe in a way, it's my favorite thing to do, find out what's going on and tell people, and try to do it in a fair way and with some extra angles that maybe other people forgot, to tie things together. I mean, you're looking at a man once young who had the privilege of being with Reagan and Gorbachev in Red Square in Moscow, or standing on the Berlin Wall on the night that East Germany gave up. Historic changes. I walked through the debris of the Pan Am plane that terrorists had blown up in the sky, and I walked through the still burning debris in Lockerbie, Scotland. All I had to do was describe what I was seeing, what was happening around me. But I do see that there's a role in a more complete form of journalism, including a high quality newspaper, for analysis. Right, but put it on a separate page, especially if it's opinionated editorial writers or columnists. Put it on a separate page so I know that it's opinion. I would like the news pages to tell us what happened in what you kindly are describing as kind of Dan Raviv type of journalism, and add detail that makes people want to read it or hear it on the radio or see it on TV or online. Yeah, but separately, I think the world does need intelligent analysis. But Adam, what you described as fragmentation, that's what comes to bear here. I feel that people who think that they're conservative in their politics only want to read conservative columnists. And the same with liberals, so-called progressives. They just want to read columnists who agree with them. I don't know what the answer is to that, because obviously we are getting into our separate little, some people call them stovepipes or little boxes that we're not even talking to each other or understanding each other. And that's a shame, because the media can be part of spreading, I think, broad information with plenty of analysis, but there are very few outlets that do that.
What do you read or do that sets you aside? I'll give you an example. Our former CBS colleague, Marvin Kalb, I asked him how he gets news from Russia. You know what he does? He sends messages to ordinary Russians. And he said many of them reply. Now, he speaks fluent Russian, so he can go back and forth them. What do you do or read that would be similar to that?
I happen to be fluent in Hebrew, right? My name is Raviv, as you heard. My parents moved from Israel to the US before I was born. But we had visits back to the grandparents, etc. So the Hebrew language was in the home. And then, it might have been you, Adam Clayton Powell III, but you or other bosses sent me to Israel. Sadat visited Begin, right? The president of Egypt, changed everything. The Arab world was no longer rejecting Israel, but willing to make peace, right? Our friend and what a guy, Walter Cronkite, right, helped bring Sadat and Begin together. Well, one result on my life was that the word went around at CBS News headquarters. This would have been late 77 into 1978. Anybody want to move to Cairo or Tel Aviv? Because that was going to be the nexus of the news. We need to beef up the coverage there. And so having the language skill, I volunteered. And so I got the Tel Aviv bureau for 2 years, and that led to the London bureau for 12 and a half years, which, as Llewellyn knows, makes a man. And so I learned so much from the experiences. Now, these days, thanks to the language skill, and still fascinated by the Middle East, and most of my books being about Israeli espionage, Israeli strategy, Israel-US relations, I listen to Israel radio every night for at least an hour. And a lot of those programs are interviewing ordinary citizens or the families of the hostages still held in Gaza, government ministers, opposition leaders. And so I'm hearing in their own language what they're all talking about there. I try to keep up with the Arab side as well. You may know there's a tradition, to be very frank, of the Arab countries not being quite so freewheeling in their journalism. You just have to read the government statement or the government approved newspaper, and I'm not so fluent in Arabic. So I think I understand Israel a lot more, and Israel is a very textured society with lots of journalism, lots of newspapers, and a lot of politicians hoping to unseat Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I continue to find it fascinating.
For the benefit of our listeners on SiriusXM Radio's POTUS channel 124, you are listening to White House Chronicle. I am Llewellyn, executive producer and host. Co-host Adam Clayton Powell III joins me. Our guest today is Dan Raviv, author, podcast host, and former CBS correspondent. His latest book is The Quest for Significance. White House Chronicle airs nationwide on PBS and public educational and government access channels. Subscribe for full episodes of White House Chronicle each week as a podcast on your favorite audio platform. Watch this and previous episodes on the White House Chronicle website, whchronicle.com. For more information on co-host Adam Clayton Powell III's University of Southern California project, contact him at truevote@usc.edu. You can find my weekly newspaper columns on Substack. I want to ask you, you've just mentioned some of your overseas assignments, which is marvelous. But we've also discussed the new journalism, which is almost individual. We can get access to the internet and put up our own thoughts, our own reporting, etc. But we don't have the wealth to travel the world. We can't bring you Lockerbie. We can't bring you Red Square. We can't bring you any of the stories you covered. We need, in journalism, a concentration of money, a lot of it, in order to be able to cover the world. So I see a world in which there's more and more commentary, more and more splintered reporting, but less and less fact on which it is based from reporters on the ground. Fortunately, we still have some large organizations, so we have reporters in Israel, in Gaza, in Ukraine, but not as many. The Baltimore Sun once had 12 overseas bureaus. It has 0 today, and that is a story across the board. So we're doing more and more with less and less that's actually directly reported from the source of the news. How does that hit you, and how do you think we can deal with it?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that too. As a consumer of news, call me a news junkie, I'm certainly looking for sources of news that still do have bureaus overseas and do still have the contact. So the New York Times has the bureaus. The Wall Street Journal, thank heavens, is almost everywhere, especially on business and finance. Bloomberg News is represented in almost 100 countries, I think, and so they're doing well. So not that many, and you're right about that. But as a consumer, I'm looking for them. So you're quite right, Llewellyn. I mean, there's a lot more commentary than there is hard facts. And that means that I'm especially concerned about the American public, which never has known that much about the world. There's a lack of constant input and education. And of course, we don't even want to try to go out on any street at all in America, Times Square or Main Street, USA, in any town, and ask people, right, take a map, right, that doesn't have the names of the countries on them, locate Japan for me, right, locate Ukraine for me, though it's in the news every day. Americans aren't that good at geography. Of course, that's a matter of education, right? What's important? The US has a place in the world, even if, say, our current president talks about America first. Look where he recently spent almost a whole week in Arabia, feeling that a great source of, well, to be frank, money, investments and buying US products would be those 3 rich Arab countries that he visited. And of course, crises happen. Even when an American president thinks that he's mostly going to concentrate on the US, there will be crises, and the American people don't know what to make of it because there isn't enough information. So you have to make the effort, right? It's available. I mean, Adam, you pointed out, right? I mean, thanks to, broadly speaking, the internet, it's incredible, the information that's available, much better than when I was working in the field in the 80s and 90s and had to check a fact. Wow, I had to somehow place a phone call to headquarters, to CBS News in New York usually, and a researcher had to somehow look up something. Right now, we all have that info, but with a little bit of a warning, there's a lot of wrong information there too, including in the new systems of AI, the artificial intelligence platforms that are meant to help us. Grok from the X or former Twitter people, Meta AI, I don't even have to name them all. ChatGPT is big and people use them. You know the verb, they hallucinate. In the AI industry, techno people say they hallucinate. We're sorry about that. We're trying to reduce the hallucinations. I figure the system wants to please you so much that instead of saying, I don't know, it's not in my data bank yet, they make up something. I've suffered that even being in a town in Italy and asking where there was a sporting goods store, and it was very precise about the address and how to get there. And it wasn't there. And I pointed it out to the AI and it said, mi dispiace. I'm sorry, really, really.
Dan, a few minutes ago, you talked about walking around, literally walking around in some of the major stories of our time. What's been the most surprising story for you?
Wow, surprises. Yeah, it's an odd thing, Adam, because again, you remember from your network news experience that the correspondent and a camera crew, I was usually doing radio, so often I was a one-man band, as we would say. But anyway, you get sent out because it has happened, right? Sometimes it is expected tomorrow, but even then it's not a surprise. So, a story that's a surprise would be where I happen to be. Here's an example. I was in the bureau at CBS News in London. It overlooks Hyde Park. The address is Knightsbridge, right next to what was called the beautiful Hyde Park Hotel. And there was the sound of an explosion really close by. An IRA car bomb had hit the ceremonial soldiers who head to the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace, right? The horses are kept pretty close there on the edge of Hyde Park. A car bomb went off. I rushed out with a tape recorder and a microphone. Right? It wasn't so portable then, no cell phones at the time. And there were dead and dying soldiers and horses. And what really struck me was one of the horsemen, Royal Guards horseman, had his pistol and was shooting the horses in the head to put them out of their misery. Um, there's a surprise. So oddly enough, we cover really big events because, as I say, we know it's happening or it just happened. I rushed to Cairo after the aforementioned President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in the early 80s because it had happened. I ended up being there for 3 weeks as we saw what would happen next. So a surprise is something that's going to happen, where you happen to be. And so I've had a few. By the way, I wasn't in New York on 9/11, but I was in the Washington Bureau where my job at the radio network was to be ready to go on the air with anything. And usually that meant in Washington a piece of legislation or a new statement from the president. But on September 11th, 2001, it was my colleague in New York, Charlie Kay, sort of the same job that you had, Adam, years ago. And Charlie Kay on the intercom said to me in Washington, Dan, look at the screen. Well, I had 4 screens of all sorts, all the networks, etc. He said, we're going to go on the air. Well, it seemed that by accident, probably, a small plane probably had hit a building I knew really well because I'm a former New Yorker. So I could describe the World Trade Center. Our station in New York had its traffic helicopter up there and going around and describing so we could go to that audio. And at 3 minutes past 9 Eastern time, as the normal news on the hour was ending, and so my colleague, Frank Sedapani, said, this is CBS News to end the 3 minutes. And it's back to me to continue our live coverage of what was probably an accident. And that's the moment the second plane hit the second tower. And so I had to just collect my thoughts in an even way, kind of like what supposedly was whispered into President George W. Bush's ear. I didn't literally say we're at war, but I told the radio audience, and all the stations had gone over to network coverage. I told the radio audience coast to coast that America is being attacked by terrorists right now. And we don't know what's next. I was on the air till 5 p.m. that day. A surprise in that Adam and Llewellyn, when I woke up that morning, it was going to be a routine Tuesday, September 11th. And that, of course, is a day that instead changed history. So you have to be ready. But Llewellyn, dare I say, and it's not about me, if possible, we need more people who've been places, who can recognize the buildings, who can understand what that sudden event probably means. We have so many people broadcasting these days who seem to have worked for about 5 days and maybe got the job because they were good with the hairdryer and the makeup. And some of them will eventually be great. But it is difficult to get a deeper understanding of something complex unless you have some of us old timers still around.
In our day, we sort of had a general agreement that you tried to be fair, that you didn't give half the facts. Maybe you did a bit of a Chinese menu. Maybe you said, nonetheless, so-and-so disagrees totally. Now, particularly in network television, that has gone away. We have dedicated cable channels to a point of view to the exclusion of all else, at a time when truth is already under attack because of conscious disinformation, misinformation, old-fashioned propaganda with tools that the czars never dreamt of to bring discredit to their enemies and often to the United States. Do you see any solution to these problems of splintering, of one-sided journalism, and of disinformation?
Well, if I were to name just two obvious examples in the world of cable news, the first of which really makes a ton of money, and I think the second's doing okay in terms of money, I mean Fox News and MSNBC. So if I were to restructure them, they would have a very fair, almost old-fashioned newscast at the top of the hour, 5 minutes, whatever it is, and then spend 25 minutes analyzing. Okay, and even if it's overwhelmingly conservative or liberal, fine. But please, could we not have separated off, labeled, here is the news to the best of our ability, trying to tell you the top stories? I would cherish that. That's not to say they'll do it, but I know, Adam and Llewellyn, we've all lived through the power of the pendulum. Things swing a bit too far in one direction and they swing back. It could be that there will be more of a taste for news down the middle in the future. So I would hang in there.
Dan, what's the future for you? You have a new book out. Are you gathering string for your next project?
I am. I think what happened in the Middle East on October 7th of 2023, when Israel's defenses on the Gaza border failed miserably, it was humiliating for the country that is known to have the best military, certainly in the Middle East, and the best intelligence service, the Mossad, which I've written so much about in my books, including Spies Against Armageddon, a history of the Mossad. And yet, October 2023, they fail. That's why we're in the mess we're in now in the Middle East. If they hadn't failed that day, if they had turned back the Hamas attackers, we wouldn't have hostages. We wouldn't have Israel now waging a frankly brutal war in Gaza, or hitting Hezbollah in Lebanon so hard, being absolutely face-to-face with Iran, maybe on the edge of war. But who knows? Maybe Iran and the U.S. wouldn't have some progress in their nuclear talks. Again, it's amazing how one day's event, the massacres and kidnappings of October 7th, when Israel took its eye off the defensive ball, how that can change so much.
Well, as we used to do in the newspaper business, it's time for us to write 30 with a little dash on either side. It's called a 9M dash, and end this program for today. Dan Raviv, thank you for coming on the broadcast, and Adam Clayton Powell, thank you for your common history, which has been so interesting. Cheers.